Good Monday morning. This is Derek Stone with Big Book Wizard, and boy, do we have a great big book study for you today. Before we jump into a review of last week, just a reminder that you can download your free copy of the Robust Recovery Checklist if you would like to keep your finger on the pulse of your recovery. Review of last week's episode, we talked about the phenomenon of craving is the unifying symptom of alcoholism. This phenomenon of craving is yet to be arrested, subdued, modified, improved by science, modern medicine, big pharma, etc. We haven't found a way to take someone who has the phenomenon of craving and make them no longer have the phenomenon of craving. We haven't found a way to remove it yet. The only relief from the phenomenon of craving that the medical community can suggest, at least in the doctor's opinion, is entire abstinence. Now, this suggestion leads most medical professionals to conclude that most chronic alcoholics are doomed because abstinence appears impossible for the real alcoholic to pull off. And as we'll see later in the book, it is in fact impossible apart from divine help. So we are going to be in the doctor's opinion on page, let me find it. So we are going to be in the doctor's opinion on page XXXI. That ought to be what it is in your book. And while you're finding that page, I want to go ahead and give a shout out to my Patreons, my supporters on patreon.com. If you see your name on this list, you are very near and dear to my heart. If you'd like to see your name on this list and support me for $1 a week, that's $5 a month, I'll send you a bookmark that I've created with the Big Book Wizard logo and the promises for easy reference, and makes a great gift for an anniversary if you know someone who's got one coming up. Okay, so on XXXI, we have what is the solution? Now, this is the doctor writing, and this is on the heels of him saying that most chronic alcoholics are doomed. And so he says, well, what is the solution? They do this later on in the book as well. You may be asking yourself, what do I have to do? And he says, perhaps I can answer this by relating one of my experiences. Now, he's doing this because as a medical professional, he's just spent the bulk of the doctor's opinion explaining to us why he feels helpless to offer a solution to alcoholism. And so he is not going to just spell out a solution here because he's already said, listen, I'm not the expert when it comes to getting alcoholics well. There's a class of people I can't help, and this book does a much better job of explaining it. And so he's just going to relate one of his solutions, and he goes on to say, and this is a pretty lengthy paragraph, about a year prior to this experience, this is the doctor talking, a man was brought in to be treated for chronic alcoholism. Now, chronic alcoholism, remember, is a term that Silkworth uses interchangeably with hopeless alcoholic. It's what the Big Book authors later on will go on to describe as the real alcoholic. He had but partially recovered from a gastric hemorrhage and seemed to be a case of pathological mental deterioration. He had lost everything worthwhile in life and was only living, one might say, to drink. He frankly admitted and believed that for him there was no hope. Following the elimination of alcohol, there was found to be no permanent brain injury, and he accepted the plan outlined in this book. 1 year later, he called to see me, and I experienced a very strange sensation. I knew the man by name and partly recognized his features, but there all resemblance ended. From a trembling, despairing, nervous wreck had emerged a man brimming over with self-reliance and contentment. I talked with him for some time, but was not able to bring myself to feel that I had known him before. To me, he was a stranger, and so left me. A long time has passed with no return to alcohol. So the doctor is describing something that goes a little bit beyond abstinence. What he is describing is what later on Anonymous will describe as spiritual awakening, and he is describing what that looks like externally. And we get the first clue as to what the spiritual awakening or spiritual experience might look like externally, and that is a person who has had one is virtually unrecognizable by the people that knew them before. And we'll see this in Bill's story, and I'm previewing a little bit in the weeks to come, because in Bill's story, when Ebby goes to visit Bill, Bill says much the same thing. There stands someone, glowing and fresh skinned and glowing. And so we know that the spiritual experience is externally visible. I remember my first few months within a 12-step fellowship attempting to get well, thinking to myself, okay, rubbing my hands together, thinking to myself, give me just a month or two, a couple of weeks at best, at worst, and I'll own this place. The lingo's pretty easy to pick up on. The people seem nice enough, and I'll figure out the talk, and I'll be able to blend right in. And after a few weeks, it dawned on me with shocking revelation. I said to myself, oh my God, you can't fake this thing. And so, that realization hit me pretty hard. And so, this is what the doctor's describing, this external difference. The next paragraph goes on to say, oops. The next paragraph goes on to say, when I need a mental uplift, I often think of another case brought in by a prominent physician in New York. The patient had made his own diagnosis and, deciding his situation hopeless, had hid it in a deserted barn, determined to die. He was rescued by a searching party and, in desperate condition, was brought to me following his physical rehabilitation. He had a talk with me in which he frankly stated he thought the treatment a waste of effort, unless I could assure him, which no one ever had, that in the future he would have the willpower to resist the impulse to drink. So So here we have the doctor describing another patient, and if you're a history buff, please leave in the comments below who this patient is. I'm not super intrigued by history and whatnot. I prefer to just know what the message of hope outlined in the book is, and I don't have much of a need for the history. But it would be an interesting fact if you know who this patient is, put it in the comments below, and you'll have respect in my heart. I already respect you. All right, the patient made his own diagnosis. So the patient decided he was hopeless, and this is actually one of the stories in the back of the book. And if you know which one, go ahead and put that in the comments below. It goes on to say, following his physical rehabilitation, he had a talk with me in which he frankly stated that he thought treatment a waste of effort unless I could assure him, which no one ever had, that in the future he would have the willpower, and willpower is in quotes here. And so the interesting thing about that is the doctor is acknowledging, by putting quotes around this, the doctor is acknowledging that this is not a matter of willpower. And this, in fact, is one of the common misconceptions for alcoholics trying to get well, is that they think that treatment or counseling or even the 12-step program is going to bring them to a place of having willpower. Because the problem is I don't have willpower, and so I need to develop willpower. And what we find out is that willpower is not the solution. Higher power is the solution. And so he puts the term willpower in quotes because when you're having that early conversation with an alcoholic, this might not be the time to correct the misconception. This might not be the time to say, well, actually, it's not going to be willpower, it's going to be higher power. Instead, as a person who's recovered from alcoholism, I can simply look at this individual and nod and say, well, actually, yes. You will develop the ability to not drink, and it'll be quite wonderful. And you'll find, through this program that you will not be hating yourself and locking yourself in a barn trying to die. And I don't have to say you'll have the willpower, but I can just tell them, your version of what you think you're here for, there is a better version of it in store. Oh, hey, that rhymed. That was kind of cool. Anyway, the doctor goes on to say, his alcoholic was so complex and his depression so great that we felt his only hope would be through what we then called moral psychology, and we doubted if even that would have any effect. And this moral psychology is in quotes because that's, if you remember earlier in the doctor's opinion, we talked about moral psychology and we talked about it in terms of, we talked about it in terms of, this is an approach to alcoholism that has more to do with issues of spirituality and right and wrong than it does with actual psychological processing or medical work. And so, it's a really poorly defined term because it's sort of a catch-all for just, we're not schooled to do this, so we're going to try to introduce this person to God, essentially. And when we get into more about alcoholism, we'll see that story with Carl Jung, where he describes the same thing. And so that's what he's saying. And so essentially, what he's saying is, we decided to turn this guy over to this 12-step thing that these people were doing over here. He goes on to say, however, he did become sold on the ideas contained in this book. He has not had a drink for a great many years. Now and then, I see him now and then, and he is as fine a specimen of manhood as one could wish to meet. And this idea of sold being in quotation marks actually goes back to the original manuscript. And the original manuscript on page 60, it currently reads, our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas, and then it gives us A, B, and C. Well, in the original manuscript, it's quite a fascinating change. The original manuscript reads, our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after have been designed to sell you 3 pertinent ideas. And so I believe Silkworth would have had access to this original manuscript. After all, Alcoholics Anonymous was asking him to write a foreword to the book. And so he would have referenced back to that and said, yeah, this guy became sold on these ideas, these 3 pertinent ideas that every alcoholic has to be sold on. And we will be discussing that more as we get into the chapter, how it works. He goes on to say, I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through, and though perhaps he came to scoff, he may remain to pray. Now, these are powerful words when you consider that they are coming from a medical doctor, and that the doctor is saying, yeah, I get it. We're referring you to this spiritual program that has nothing to do with medicine or psychology, and you might be scoffing at that, and you might show up initially to scoff at this idea of prayer, and to scoff at this idea of God, and to scoff at this idea of inventory and spirituality, but you might actually remain to pray. You might find yourself starting to pray, which are the 2 examples of the stories that the doctor uses here. Before I get into the announcements, I just want to say, if you or someone you know needs help, feel free to reach out. I've got a page where you can submit your information, and I'll connect you up to some professionals, bigbookwizard.net/help. If you'd like to win a free study edition Big Book, visit bigbookwizard.net/enter. This thing's a hardcover, leather bound. Every other page is lined so that you can take notes. It's got tassels so you can keep your place. It's got a dictionary, bunch of cool stuff in there. And if you want to chat with me on social media, you can do that as well. I like interacting with the people who view these videos. And if you want to sign up to attend these Big Book studies live, that's bigbookwizard.net/join. And if nobody has told you yet today that they love you, please let me be the first. And with that, I will say, be well and God bless. Thanks for attending.